Trump has spent this entire trade war taxing steel, aluminum, dairy, cars, and lumber moving across the Canadian border. Almost none of that cargo reaches American mills, farms, or factories without first passing through a series of massive concrete gates that Canada, not the United States, actually controls. The St. Lawrence Seaway, the water highway connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the entire Great Lakes region, runs through 15 locks. 13 of them sit on Canadian soil, operated by a Canadian corporation, under Canadian law. Trump has spent over a year taxing everything that floats through that system. He's never once had to reckon with who actually opens the gates. Here's what we're covering. First, we'll lay out exactly how the St. Lawrence Seaway works and why 13 of its 15 locks ending up on Canadian territory isn't some historical accident. It's the direct result of a decision Canada made 70 years ago. Then we'll get into the 2 American locks specifically, because their location tells you almost everything about how much actual independent control the US really has over this system. After that, we'll cover what's actually moving through these locks right now, and how exposed American steel mills, grain exporters, and manufacturers already are to disruptions in this exact corridor. We'll look at what happened the last time this system shut down entirely, because it already gave us a preview of what real leverage here looks like. And finally, we'll talk honestly about the limits of this leverage, because the full picture is more complicated than Canada holds all the cards. Let's start with the numbers themselves, because they're almost comically lopsided. The Montreal to Lake Ontario stretch of the Seaway contains 7 locks, 5 Canadian, 2 American, sitting near Massena, New York. The Welland Canal, which bypasses Niagara Falls entirely and connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, contains 8 more locks, and every single one of them runs through Canadian territory from end to end. Added up, and 13 of the Seaway's 15 locks belong to Canada, operated today by the St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation on behalf of the Canadian government. This isn't a minor technical detail buried in an infrastructure report. It's the physical choke point every ocean-going ship has to pass through to reach ports like Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, or Duluth from the Atlantic. To put the scale of these locks in perspective, each one measures roughly 233 meters long, 76 feet wide, and 30 feet deep over the sill, engineered to lift ships as long as a football field and a half up nearly 180 meters above sea level, as high as a 60-story building, across the full run from Montreal to Lake Erie. The Welland Canal alone lifts ships 99.5 meters, actually exceeding the height of Niagara Falls itself, just to get vessels from Lake Ontario up to Lake Erie. This is genuinely one of the most impressive engineered waterway systems on the planet, and the overwhelming majority of it sits under Canadian jurisdiction, operated, maintained, and staffed by Canadians every single day, regardless of what's happening in the broader trade relationship above it. Here's why it ended up this way, and it's a genuinely interesting piece of history. Canada rebuilt the Welland Canal entirely on its own between 1913 and 1932. When it came time to build the larger Montreal to Lake Ontario section decades later, the United States was reluctant to commit to the larger joint project. Canada's response, in 1951, was blunt. It threatened to simply build an entire seaway using only its own territory, cutting the U.S. out of the project altogether. That threat is what finally forced Washington to the table, and the 2 countries reached a formal agreement in 1954. Construction began that August, and the Seaway opened to commercial traffic in 1959, with an official ceremony attended by Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, President Dwight Eisenhower, and Queen Elizabeth II. And there's real cargo riding on this system right now. Cargo directly tied to the same industries, caught up in Trump's tariffs. According to the Lake Carriers Association, U.S.-flagged Great Lakes freighters carried over 71 million tons of cargo in 2025, with iron ore alone accounting for roughly 40% of total Great Lakes tonnage, moving from mines in Minnesota and Wisconsin to steel mills in Hamilton, Ontario, and Gary, Indiana. The Duluth Superior Port Authority noted that almost a third of the iron ore sailing from that port in a recent season went directly to Canada, meaning American iron ore and Canadian steel production are already deeply intertwined through exactly this shipping corridor. Trade publication AJOT reported this year that American ports along the Great Lakes and Seaway are being hit harder by the 50% steel and aluminum tariffs than ports in other U.S. regions, precisely because so much of this specific trade flows through Canadian waters and Canadian-controlled infrastructure before it ever reaches an American mill. The port-level data backs this up in granular detail too. The Port of Cleveland saw its steel imports drop roughly 30% last year as companies stockpiled ahead of anticipated tariffs, and this year's volume sits at about half of what it was in mid-2024. Iron ore shipments on the Great Lakes were down 23.5% in March of this year compared to the same month a year earlier, falling well below the 5-year seasonal average. Port officials in Duluth and Green Bay have described 2025 and 2026 as genuinely difficult shipping seasons, citing tariff uncertainty directly alongside reduced construction and manufacturing demand as the drivers. This is real, measurable disruption showing up in port-by-port tonnage figures, not an abstract policy debate playing out only in press releases. There's also a real-world preview of what happens when this exact system stops moving. In 2023, a labor dispute shut down the Seaway entirely, stranding over 100 vessels across the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario, including a U.S. Navy warship that couldn't leave port in Cleveland. The Welland Canal became a major bottleneck, with roughly 25 ships anchored outside its entrances on both the Lake Erie and Lake Ontario sides. Estimated economic impact ran to $110 million a day. In other words, the lopsided ownership split isn't an oversight. It exists specifically because Canada built and paid for most of this system, and was willing to build the rest without American involvement if Washington kept dragging its feet. That history matters more than it might first appear, because it establishes a pattern that's arguably repeating itself right now, 70 years later. Then, as now, Canada faced American hesitation and simply moved forward on its own terms, building leverage through infrastructure investment rather than waiting for Washington's blessing. The parallel to Canada's current pivot toward European markets for aluminum, German shipyards for submarines, and Asian buyers for potash is hard to ignore. A country that has, more than once in its history, responded to American reluctance by simply building the alternative itself rather than accepting a permanently subordinate position in the relationship. Now look closely at where America's only two locks actually sit, because the geography here is almost poetic. The Eisenhower and Snell locks near Massena, New York, sit sandwiched in the middle of the Montreal to Lake Ontario section, with Canadian locks on either side. A ship passing through those two American locks still cannot reach the open ocean, and still cannot reach the upper Great Lakes without passing through Canadian gates first. Strategically speaking, America's two locks function less like an independent choke point and more like two doors sitting in the middle of a hallway Canada owns from end to end. It's worth being fair here too. The Soo locks at Sault Ste. Marie, which connect Lake Huron to Lake Superior, are entirely American, operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they matter enormously for iron ore moving out of Minnesota. So this isn't a story of Canada controlling literally every lock on the Great Lakes. It's specifically the ocean-to-lakes gateway, the Seaway itself, where Canadian control is this dominant. But even during the height of this trade war, ships have continued moving through Canadian locks carrying American cargo, and American locks carrying Canadian cargo, without disruption tied to the tariff dispute itself. That cooperative reality matters, and it would be dishonest to frame this system as a weapon quietly waiting to be pulled, when in practice it's continued operating as smoothly as it always has throughout this entire dispute. But that's exactly what makes this story worth understanding rather than dismissing. Trump has spent over a year treating tariffs as the primary lever in this relationship, taxing goods moving in one direction while apparently never fully reckoning with the fact that the physical infrastructure moving those goods runs disproportionately through Canadian hands. It's not that Canada is threatening to close the locks. It's that the entire architecture of this trade relationship was built 70 years ago in a way that gives Canada structural leverage over the literal water route connecting half of America's industrial heartland to the Atlantic Ocean. And that leverage exists whether or not anyone in Washington ever bothers to notice it. So that's the full picture: 13 locks, one binational waterway, and a piece of infrastructure built specifically because Canada was willing to go it alone 70 years ago rather than wait indefinitely for American cooperation. There's a broader pattern worth carrying away from this story beyond just the Seaway itself. Leverage in a trade relationship. This deeply integrated rarely comes from a single dramatic threat. It comes from the accumulated weight of infrastructure, geography, and history quietly built up over decades, often for reasons that had nothing to do with the dispute playing out today. Canada didn't build 13 of 15 Seaway locks anticipating a tariff war with Trump 70 years later. It built them because Washington wouldn't commit to the project at the time. That leverage simply sat there, unused and mostly unnoticed, until a moment like this one made people start asking who actually controls the water route running through the middle of North America's industrial heartland. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Washington ever factors this kind of infrastructure leverage into future trade negotiations? Or does it keep getting overlooked in favor of simpler tariff fights?